Hey, YouTube folks! Welcome to another video on this channel, Drisco. And in today's video, I'm going to bring you a bit more about this bombshell news that's been shaking up the chess world. As you already know, the current world champion, Magnus Carlsen, dropped out of the Super Tournament Cinquefield Cup, an extremely traditional tournament that takes place in St. Louis. And he dropped out of this tournament. Right after the game I'm bringing you today, the game played against the American Super Grandmaster, Hans Niemann. The reasons he dropped out are still unclear. In fact, Magnus made a statement that ended up generating even more interpretations and doubts. And I'm going to bring you the whole background of this news. Hans started to become more popular on the internet and also went viral in some interview videos because Hans proved to be an extremely controversial and eccentric player as well. Hans recently played in the Chess Tour, which was a tournament we streamed live, and in the Chess Tour. He ended up finishing last in the tournament, but he won a game against Magnus Carlsen, and after that victory, he was interviewed. People asked him about his reactions and his thoughts after the game. And watch the answer that Hans gave, which made him go even more viral on the internet. Keep an eye out, Hans.
Yesterday was awful, but today you began with a masterpiece. How would you sum it up? I'll do it.
Chess speaks for itself. It's something special to do this against Magnus, Hans. As you saw, Hans is a more eccentric player. He gave a different response over there, turned his back. Didn't even look back. Now, Hans has become much more popular on the internet after these stances, which are funnier, different, they go viral online. And Hans was invited then to play in the Cinquefield Cup, this tournament that he's facing again here. Magnus Carlsen, a game in the classical format in person. And Hans wins this game that I'm bringing here today against Magnus. Here's the situation. Was what happened in the game the trigger for Magnus to leave the tournament? Or maybe it was the post-game interview where Hans once again made some sharper, a bit harsher statements. Regarding the world champion, pay attention to what Hans said right after this game. It's on air.
Describe the world champion's body language here. After reaching move 40, he didn't get up from his chair as usual. He stayed at the board.
Well, he has some tics. I noticed that. Okay, maybe that's it. I shouldn't have used that word. He has habits. I don't want to get canceled here. Habits, please. Thank God I said that. I corrected myself. Habits. From playing with him, I noticed he gives a slight smile when he wants to show dominance. He wasn't smiling, maybe once or twice. That made me feel really good. Because I grew up watching him. I watched all of his interviews. He once said in an interview that spending over 10 minutes on a move is a really bad sign. And he did that a lot in this game, so that increased my confidence. But I think it's okay. Even if it was a draw, I think he was so demoralized because he's losing to an idiot like me. It must be embarrassing for the world champion to lose to me. I feel bad for him. As you saw, a somewhat more controversial interview, according to some of Hans's statements. And after that interview, the next day, Magnus Carlsen didn't show up to play in the tournament anymore. Magnus made a statement here on Twitter, which wasn't clarifying at all. In fact, it ended up creating more doubt and more interpretations about what could have motivated Magnus to leave the tournament. Look at what Magnus tweeted. And on Twitter, Magnus posted, "I withdrew from the tournament. I've always enjoyed playing at the St. Louis club and hope to return in the future." And right below, he posted a video of Mourinho saying that if he spoke, he would be in serious trouble. As you saw, Magnus's Twitter isn't very enlightening. On the contrary, it ends up generating more doubts and more interpretations about what led him to abandon this super event. Now, after this tweet, the chess community started to have some different viewpoints and hypotheses to try to understand what Magnus might be trying to say. So there's the viewpoint that leans toward cheating, where Magnus might be trying to say that his opponent Hans, in this game that I'm bringing today, could he have used some kind of assistance tool, some way to cheat, some use of a device during the game? And we're going to try to investigate that here today as well. Or other aspects that may be related to the interview. Since Hans's interview was a bit sharper, a bit more aggressive, Magnus might have felt disrespected and left the tournament. So it's really a huge controversy. Now let's try to understand it here by looking at this game. If so, Hans might have used some form of cheating. And now let's get to this very controversial analysis. So guys, here we are. And playing white was the world champion, Magnus Carlsen, against Hans Niemann. And Magnus starts this game with d4. He started solid like a rock, and Hans played a Nimzo Indian here. At this moment, we already have something interesting here. Magnus plays here, g3, which isn't a very popular move. It's a sub-variation that's used very rarely. Now, something else interesting here is that in the interview, Hans comments about this g3 and says that he had studied the same sub-variation in depth that very morning before the match. Something curious when the reporter asks, "But why were you watching this game?" He says that he was studying it because Magnus had already played this same variation against Wesley Soa in 2018. Later, after checking the databases, the chess community couldn't find this game, which ended up fueling even more controversy and doubts. Well, at this point, bishop to g2 is played, d5 all normal. Apparently, the knight took here on c3, and now the pawn on c4 is captured. At this moment, Magnus moves the knight to f3 and c5. It's very important to highlight this here. Also, Magnus is a very flexible player when it comes to his repertoire, so he can play anything. Magnus has several types of preparation, so this g3 here was possibly a preparation, something he was going to use here as a middle game idea. But Hans played very well and solidly, as you'll see. Well, at this moment, Magnus castled. And now came the capture of the d4 pawn. Magnus recaptures with the queen and knight to c6, then takes the c4 pawn and e5. And from here, the game starts to take a slightly sharper course. Because Magnus plays bishop to g5, and after h6, he doesn't move the bishop away from the pawn's attack. He plays rook to d1 here, which, according to Hans in the interview, is already a small inaccuracy. Now, something very curious. In these post-game interviews, there were some variations where Hans ended up hanging a piece here, something that can happen. But at the same time, Hans held the line very well here, which was the main line. He said this move wasn't precise when analyzed by the engine. Really, it's not the best move according to the engine, right? Nothing that leaves you lost but Hans. He holds on to the line here by taking on f6, which is the line suggested by the computers. He instantly recited the full line during the St. Louis interview. Queen takes f6, knight to d2. He instantly knew the best engine moves, bishop to g4. And here he hesitated a bit, but he also got the move right, rook to f1, which shows that yes, he possibly studied this variation that morning because he knew the whole line. So it raises many questions about everything, right? Although it's a very hard hypothesis to believe that he studied this in the morning since he knew the whole line by heart, apparently it was true. But you can't vouch for it. We're trying to understand the data, right? Well, after this move here, rook to d1, Hans plays the best move for black here, which is a bishop move. On e6, counterattacks the Norwegian's queen, lets the queen on d8 be captured, and enters this endgame. Magnus doesn't have many options, okay? He played d8, Hans played c4, they exchanged on a8, and now Magnus. The bishop here is under threat, and so is the pawn on e2. So he's forced to give up the bishop pair by taking on f6. And at this moment, he played king f1, which isn't a very precise move, okay? It's a playable move, but it's not the most accurate. There are better ideas for white here, like the move knight to h4 looking for counterplay, right? Sacrificing the e2 pawn to advance the knight and threaten h3, opening up the bishop and trying to bring the rook with some initiative here for white. It's still a complicated position. Now, Magnus played the move king f1 here. Another possible hypothesis is that really on that day, Magnus wasn't playing his best chess. That's possible, right? He's a human being, until proven otherwise, right? He's a human being, and he might not have been having his best day. He'll end up losing this game. In one of the phases of the game where Magnus is very, very strong, which is the endgame, well, at this moment, the move was played here. Rook to d8, Magnus blocked any invasion and set up a rook trade on d1. Hans played knight to a5, then rook to d1. At this moment, the American Grandmaster plays the strongest move. He doesn't trade the rooks, he keeps the rook, now putting pressure on a weakness in the white position. That c3 pawn, It's a very good move, a very strong move that keeps black's chances of winning in this game. Well, here, Magnus played knight to d2, and after the move bishop to e6, Magnus made a very practical decision here from a human perspective. The c3 pawn, it's under threat. You can defend this pawn, just stay here as a defender, right? But Magnus, he sacrifices the c4 pawn to go after the initiative. That's what he's aiming for in this game. Hans took on c4, Magnus exchanged here, and rook takes on c4, which is the best move for black to fight for the win. See what happens if Hans joins the knight. In this variation, he allows rook to d7, giving Magnus more activity and pressure on the pawns. Bishop to d5 might be coming. Also f7, is that bad? So Hans defended his initiative perfectly here. He captured with the rook, and now Magnus. He played rook to d8 king to g7 and bishop to d5, centralizing the bishop, watching the f7 pawn and threatening rook to d7. Hans defended well again, playing rook to c7 to protect the 7th rank, then rook to a8. Magnus is looking for some initiative. Hans defended with rook to b8 and now f5. Hans is starting to gain space here on the king's side. Magnus played rook to e8 here, and e4 was played by Hans, defending the pawn that was under threat. And now Magnus plays g4 here, which is an inaccuracy. From here, the game becomes very tough for Magnus. Of course, Hans still needs to find the right moves, right? Rook to c5 was played, targeting the bishop. The bishop retreats to a2, then knight moves to c4. Hans advances his pieces, threatening the a3 pawn. The knight move to c4 is inaccurate. The computers say that if Magnus played a4 here, okay? But that's what the computers say. If he exchanged here and went into this rook endgame, white would possibly be able to secure a draw here. It's still an extremely complicated position. Hans, in interviews, said that it's unlikely a human would take that knight. Since this endgame favors black, he defended the idea from a human perspective. But the computers say that this position would actually be a draw. Now, I partly agree with him, okay? This endgame appears lost for white, with everything collapsing. At this point, Magnus played a4, but it's important to point out that knight to c4 is an inaccuracy. It's trying to follow the engine's line, right? Knight to c4 is inaccurate. Now, knight to d6 is played, a strong move. Hans controls and threatens. The rook defends the b7 pawn. Magnus plays rook to e7. Now, with pressure building on the f7 pawn, Hans eliminates the grob pawn. Rook to d7 is played, threatening the knight. At this moment, e3 Hans makes a strong tactical move. Notice that he takes away some squares from the king here and threatens nothing less than mate. But Raphael chess is falling. The knight that Magnus played, Magnus took here on e3. You must be shouting, but Raphael chess, why didn't Magnus take here? This loses since Hans now plays rook to c1. And no matter how you defend mate, there's the deflection theme. I capture on f2. If the king takes, the rook is lost. If the king moves to d2, I trade rooks and promote the pawn. I win the game as black. Naturally, Magnus avoided this grob-style trap. He took on e3, and now Hans plays knight to e4, a very strong move. Threatens mating ideas and defends the b7 pawn. Taking the b7 pawn leads to checkmate by rook to c1. So, at this moment, Magnus played king to f1, getting out of the mating threats, and Hans looks for activity. Rook to c1, king to g2, then he moves his rook to the 7th rank, now threatening this spot and the bishop. But it's a sharp line, because Magnus takes on f7. Hans takes the pawn on e2, and then after that, they repeat the position here. Look, they repeat the position with king to f6. This is an important moment because right now they're getting close on move 40, which gave an extra time on the clock. So, repeating makes perfect sense, right? Hans moved the king to escape check, and Magnus played bishop to d5 and rook to d2. An interesting idea. Because Magnus puts himself in this pin. Here, Magnus plays rook to f7, and after king to g6, he goes back to the pin theme. So, an extremely difficult position. And here, knight to g5 is a very subtle move by Hans, which will be supported by tactical themes. He's keeping an eye on this fork idea here that could come up between the d2 square and the g1 square. Why? Because now Magnus plays bishop to f7, and look, it seems like black is going to lose a rook, but not everything is defended. Hans moves the king out of danger. Now he takes on d2 knight to f3 with a fork, and recovers the material, going into this endgame that's advantageous for black. Hans still has an extra pawn. This is an extremely complicated endgame to play because In many variations, you can draw this position. Now, Magnus played the move a5, fixing the structure on light squares. Notice that he can eventually capture all these pawns if black allows it. Then king e5 was played. Hans defends the idea of the bishop threatening the b7 pawn king g3, and here, boom, knight f1. A very annoying move, as it checks and threatens both the e3 and h2 pawns. Here, Magnus played king f2. Now, you must be shouting, but Raphael, why didn't he take on g4? This isn't good for white. Knight takes h2, king g3, knight f1. Then, after king f2, the knight. Back to the game. Can't you capture here? It creates a passed pawn threat, and the e3 pawn can be targeted. Is this endgame hard? No, this endgame is tough. But Magnus avoided that and played king f2, maintaining some tension in the position. Hans took on h2 and now e4, and in this position, Magnus's defense seems a bit desperate, but he has his ideas because Hans takes on e4 and now Hans has two passed pawns. But Magnus has his plans. Look, he plays bishop e6 and now he wants to play bishop c8 and all the pawns on the queen side will fall. Hans here only has one possible continuation. He's going to get the move right. Look, he plays king f4, defends this pawn, bishop c8. It seems everything will fall here. And white can create counterplay with the a-pawn, but Hans had everything at his fingertips. He played knight to f3, and the idea is that this knight, which seems really far away, will take the a5 pawn at the right moment. Keep an eye on it. Magnus took on b7. Hans moved the knight to e5, took on a6, and knight to c6 arrives in time to take the only white pawn, the passed pawn, now on a5. Magnus played bishop to b7, but then knight to a5. Here, he's completely lost because the American now has two passed pawns, and this endgame is completely won. Magnus moved his bishop to d5 to centralize it, and now h5 is advancing. The pawns played bishop f7 and h4, followed by bishop d5 and king e5. At this moment, Magnus Carlsen resigned from this controversial game, because the two pawns would decide the Agar Loke Agas game. This match, which in many cases was interpreted as possible computer assistance, let's see how it looked at first. Look at the accuracy of this game. And the accuracy of the game is up in the air. Look, I calculated this pressure here on chess with maximum depth, and here it is. Look, 86-0 for Magnus Carlsen. Notice that this is a pressure below Magnus's normal average, already indicating that he might not be having one of his best days as a chess player. And Hans had about 93% pressure, which is apparently extremely normal for an elite super grandmaster. In many games, an elite player can achieve even higher pressure than that in a classical game. Now, comment below what your point of view is about Magnus's withdrawal from the tournament. Is it really related to the use of Ngini for cheating? It could also be related to Hans's slightly more aggressive attitude in interviews or any other reason. All of this is still a complete mystery. Leave a comment, because I'm curious to know